for us. Okay, lovely people. So we're going to open the afternoon session with our panel. The title in the program is Yale Fellows Panel Digital Archive. That doesn't tell you a whole lot. What we're going to do is just try and give you some context about how the Yale Fellows have been involved in the INBEST project, in the Intersectional Black European Studies project. And we're going to focus, the main event is going to be the time you spent this summer, 2023 in Berlin, the first steps of archiving in Berlin. So just to give you an idea before I shortly introduce the panel, there were 7 Yale Fellows who were in Berlin for about 3 weeks in the summer. And these fellows are Jorge Banelos, Roy Celaire, Elizabeth Crabeil, I think I'm saying your name wrong, Isaac Jean-Francois, Sam Jones, Faith Macheria, Ali Touilila. And here in conversation with me are going to be, to my immediate left, Faith Macheria, who is a PhD student in African American Studies and in Anthropology. And then to my very far left, Sam Jones, who is a PhD student in the French department and in African American Studies. And in the middle of Sam and Faith is Jorge Banelos. You're a PhD student in Religious Studies and in African American Studies. So we are going to give the good people in this room an idea of what kind of where we are in the process and what we were doing in Berlin. So Sam and Faith and Jorge had formulated some opening thoughts, and we are basically going to we're going to do about 3 rounds here, then we'll open it up to the public. We want to speak about how you entered Berlin. I called it an introduction to Black Berlin, but for some of you, it's a reintroduction. Some, I think you have been in Berlin before, or you haven't. And Faith, you have been doing work in Italy, so you've been definitely spending the summer in Europe, then you did a stint to Berlin and went back and forth. So it's either an introduction to Berlin or to Black Berlin or a reintroduction. And the idea of framing it as Black Berlin, we already had in the panel before, that Fatima El-Tayeb chaired with Professor Gail Lewis, Professor Gloria Wecker. We already had about conceptualizations of Black Europe, of Blackness. And when we frame Black Berlin from INBEST, then it's one way of recentering the history of Berlin. There's actually an official film called 100 Years of History in Berlin that shows nothing about 1884 and 1885, the Wilhelmstrasse scramble and partition of Africa. This has been contested. And so when we speak about Black Berlin, it's about contestations, but it's also a love letter to Berlin and the way we experience Berlin as people who sometimes the spaces are not made for, as racially marginalized people, as people who embody a Black life. So that's also the idea of Black Berlin, to look at the archives in Berlin from the lens of INBEST. So that's going to be our first step. Our second step is going to be doing this kind of work and arriving. Of course, we have ideas about how to archive. Then we get there, and then a lot of stuff does not work the way we thought it was going to work. So that's generally called life on any given day. But we want to understand what it means with looking at our Gegenstand, at what we were trying to work on, archiving Black knowledges, marginalized Black knowledges. So we're going to speak about barriers and some of the things the fellows were confronted with and how you worked around those. And then we want to hear a little bit about what your preliminary results are. We already had you working towards a manual to give folks an idea of where to start when they're starting to archive community-based materials that sometimes are in basements that are wet, and then the materials are going to disintegrate. So there's also a time, it's also time sensitive, or where we had about folks who are not going to be on the planet for very long. So that's also time sensitive. So what kind of results we have, the exhibition, it's a very mini impulse to a lot of work that has been done. So the work that these people have been doing cannot be captured in the small room. It's just a way to build a bridge to give you an idea of what the materiality. of this process was. Okay, I'm talking too long. I want to hand over to the fellows. So tell me something about how you entered, the entry point into Black Berlin. Tell us anything. Can I start with you, Jorge?
Might as well. Hey, good afternoon, y'all. Thank you so much for the introduction. I feel a lot less nervous having Maisha as a moderator. So for me, I'll speak a little bit about my work and then like coming into the project as well. So for me in religious studies, I work as a historian and a theorist of religion. I'm really interested in like recolonization, repatriation movements of the continent, the settling of Liberia, for example, and thinking about that as sort of like an influence on the project or the enterprise of Black religious studies. What that means is I really don't study Europe. Europe is definitely central, you know, thinking about Atlantic abolitions or whatnot. And so coming into it, I was definitely not, I'm not a German speaker either, but I was just coming with a very profound, just love for Black people and care for the histories and the stories that we carry. But it was a good experience to come in, and I definitely enjoyed my time there as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, if Professor El-Tayeb and Professor Becker and Professor Lewis are nervous, then just imagine how nervous we are without, anyway, all of those accomplishments. Yeah, no, I would echo what Jorge said. I work on Europe, I work on France and sort of visions of Blackness specifically in France and how sort of visions of race in the US intermingle with those visions of race in the in France and what the results of that is. Nonetheless, I found, you know, arriving in Berlin to be pretty disorienting. I think also humbling. You know, like Jorge said, I don't speak German. And so I'm used to traveling in some ways, but traveling to a country where, you know, not only you don't speak the language, but also you walk out into the city and you're sort of surrounded by text that you can't really access. And there's something about that that I think is also is really interesting. But I think, I mean, if we were able to accomplish anything in the project, it was also in large part due both to, you know, the support of people who have already spoken today, like Peggy, like Katya, like Maisha, like Professor El-Tayeb, obviously, but also, you know, there are people who aren't here, who are the German grad students, the grad students from Berlin who helped us, who were, I think, instrumental in helping us get to what we did get to. And so, yeah, no, I would just add that as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm Faith Macheria, and my work is on the slippage of Blackness and Africanity in Italy. So I was in Rome for the whole year, and I had the great opportunity, thanks to everyone on the German INBEST team and also here at Yale with Fatima, that I had the privilege of going to examine Black life also in Berlin. And for me, it was different because I have encountered so many African migrants in Rome who their goal is to move on past Italy. Italy is just a transition point for some of the migrants there. And Germany is one of the countries they look up to. They're excited about Germany, their rights, there are all these things you can get as a Black African migrant there. And it was interesting to even meet a Black African who was in Italy and had moved there like about 10 years ago, and he was there in Berlin. And I think it really shaped how I understood Black European history, the sort of silences that I keep encountering, that so many people in this room have worked so hard to change. And so that was kind of like my first introduction, a sort of curiosity to learn more for my research. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jorge, Sam, and Faith. Just a follow-up again to kind of pick up the threads that you've begun speaking about. So the love for Blackness, or being embedded in a certain way of self-world relations, as what you're bringing to archiving. And then Sam, you've emphasized again and again, I have no idea if you're going to maybe read some excerpts from the other students, that this was a project embedded in different groups of students. So it was a team teaching, a cross-border team teaching seminar with my students from gender studies who are from the TU Berlin, but also from the HU Berlin. And then from Dr. Karina Griffith, her class from the University of Arts, UDK, Universität der Künste in Berlin. And then there were you people. And you are the senior people. I know it's hard to hear that when you're this young, but you are the ones who are very along the way. You're sometimes, I think, third year PhD, fifth, okay. Like I said, you're very advanced people. And we also had in our other groups, we had people who were folks who were doing their bachelor. So there was a lot also of patience sometimes that was required to take along the whole group. And on the other hand, there was a lot of translation going on about the texts. And then Faith, the point that you're making, which for me is a huge fascination, is transnational Berlin. So there's also this idea that one of the shaping experiences of Blackness is how we can engage with the European continent, and that one of those is about the policing of the Mediterranean, and obviously everything that belongs to how we, to quote Gloria Anzaldúa, how we rub up against those or run up against those barriers and bleed. And that you're also speaking about the relation of the locations within Europe to each other, and how global Blackness or Africanness is also a theme by relating and linking those spaces and hoping and imagining one space to be able to make a certain level of Black lives possible, which sometimes doesn't exactly translate into what it does, into what is hoped, but sometimes we can make something out of it. So that's just to kind of like touch on those points and say, that's what I am hearing. I'm kind of mirroring. This isn't even a question. I thought it was a question. It's not a question. When it came out, I realized I have no question, which happens to me very, I'm just rambling thoughts out of my head. So I'm going to move on and ask you to say something about the interaction within the student groups, within the different, folks had different objectives. There were students who were exchange students from China, for example, at the University of Arts. There were some who spoke in English and were extremely relieved that a group comes that where we now mostly speak English. There were folks who only speak German. There was a large number of BIPOC scholars. Tell us something about that interaction. Who wants to start?
No.
Okay.
I can start with just a brief comment where I have to say that it was really exciting to be in a group of just diverse students who are not also just PhD students. I think it was great to think with them in various moments. And personally speaking, even just as a Kenyan American, there were moments where I felt like I was not the right person of authority. I don't know how to quite explain that, in the sense that as Americans, often there's so much power embedded in who we are, what institutions are backing us, and what kind of work we're doing there. And for me, it was really important, one, as an anthropologist, being in the space, seeing people, talking to them, working with them, understanding their vision of what their project is. For the Berlin group was really awesome. Even the workshops, thinking with the Living Archive, I learned so much from that. And I think, yeah, that was, for me, it was a space where academia was a little bit more expanded than the usual classroom setting where you're just discussing text and work. And this was like, we're gonna do action, we're gonna do something, and we're gonna talk amongst us. And especially listening to the Black Berlin students, for me, that was one of the most important times and important voices. And I remember conversations Roy and I had with Karina that we might talk about later, but some of these moments were the most important, I think, for this project, not just doing it from here, because I think it could have been digitized in Berlin and we do the, the website archiving, the rest of it here, but I think it made a difference for us to be there with the people whose work we're really trying to archive as well.
Yeah, I definitely want to like echo a lot of your sentiment. And I think for me, what I really appreciated was that even though our institutions kind of brought us together, I don't think we only related to each other's academics. I think definitely we came together as just people who were concerned about, the preservation of Black history and Black stories, people who were just, Black in context, but were also, various degrees of marginal as well. And it was nice to like kind of just engage in a level of like humility and politeness with the students. I remember, Scott, this is something you had mentioned in one of our interviews, that it's just good to come into a context where you don't really know as much, you're not familiar with the cultural milieux, you don't speak the language to a degree, but just to come be polite, understand that you have something to share, but also you have a lot to learn and gain as well. And I think I definitely learned a lot and gained a lot from having that kind of collaborative space, both with students who are like master students in arts, for example, coming with like a different set of expertises to the project as well. And so I think definitely just it was nice to kind of like be in that collaborative environment with different people.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo things that both Jorge and Faith had said. There was one of the more interesting moments for me. We had another panel when we were in Berlin talking about sort of institutionalizing Black studies in Germany, in Berlin specifically. And that sort of opened with conversations between ourselves and other members of the team and the sort of collected grad students from Berlin. And I think what was so interesting about that was sort of these sort of productive opacities that came out. There was sort of, we had all of these experiences having predominantly attended school, undergrad in the United States, where sort of we said, oh, well, you should go occupy the president's office, or you should do this, or you should encourage a boycott. And there was one German grad student, we were talking about private investment in public German universities. And so a solution that was provided was, what if you were to tell people on the street that, this German corporation is, invested in a university that won't provide Black studies or something like that. And the student was like, well, I think if we went and told average German people on the street that this was happening, that either A, they wouldn't care, or they would be more likely to, buy something from that corporation. And so there are these moments of opacity that are productive, where it's, again, I think, as Jorge and Faith are saying, where it's sort of, we're there to share, but it's more importantly there to learn. And that, I think that panel experience was interesting, because at the end of the day, I sort of felt like we should have been, the German grad students should have been giving the panel, and we should have been listening, because a lot of the things that we said were just not, were just sort of incommensurate with like the setting that we were speaking in.
Thank you again. And again, I'd like to link that to some thoughts. So Sam, the setting you were speaking about was the networking day, where the BIPOC referat or chapter of the student representation visited us, and was very excited to hear how you wrestle with certain issues. So you're very humble to say that you didn't really have any insights for them, but I think for them it was interesting to hear about unionizing, about how you're in a specific context, you use specific tools, what you struggle with, sometimes also what kinds of desperation we have to just kind of collectively nurture or something. So still being in conversation with them, I know it was a big takeaway for them. And then the other context, just also to inform those who were not in the summer program, you were all very open to the different suggestions we had for events. So there was a spontaneous event that happened with Namibian queer activists who formed a panel, a very large panel of 5 people. And then Fatima had a collaboration with Professor Tevia Nyongo, Professors Jack Halberstram and Damian Young, if I'm not wrong. And they brought in a whole group in the evening with a lot of food. So we were in this room, I think we were like 90 folks with extremely good food. It was at the end of the semester, just to give you an idea of what the kind of setting was. And the Namibian queer activists was live streaming and kind of talking back also to their government, who has some issues around suppressing queerness and Black queer lives at the moment. So this panel also happened. And what I'm trying to say is that because you said all three of you, Jorge, that it was a lot about you weren't just there as grad students, but it was also a form of making connections and connecting meanings, and then trying to see what does that mean for the way we work. So that's also interesting to see that this was a backdrop. Before I move on to the barriers about what was hard, where was the heavy lifting and everything, is there anything else you'd like to say about any of the other program points that you did? Or I think there was also a group going to Berlin CSD or something. I'm not very sure. There were different. There was definitely the techno parade. I saw some buses going to the techno parade. Okay, I do have a question. I'm rambling again. I want to say I'm very brave for taking the graveyard shift directly after lunch, but you have to put up with my rambling thoughts. This is me partly trying to digest my excellent food. The point I'm trying to make is this about archiving in real time. So then the Namibian activists were live streaming on Instagram, I'm guessing. And we also took some pictures or conversations. All of my pictures are just in my phone. I have done nothing with them. And we do have an INBEST Instagram page and so on. So we have the big archiving, we have like different layers of archiving. And just around the practicality of what we're doing, I'm going to suspect you also have a lot of photos you haven't posted or you've posted them, I have no idea. Tell me anything about what we're doing while we are archiving, how we're making this process, how we're documenting this process. Are you documenting it? Are you as bad as I am? Because I am really bad at Instagram. I'm not a content maker. I am kind of, because I take pictures, but I don't do anything with them. And I'm a reposter. It's easy for me to repost. I'm just going to give the microphone because I'm going to continue rambling if I don't. So.
I mean, yeah, also on the archiving bit. So one of the things that we did with the fellowship is we created journals. A lot of the journals included photos, they included experiences, to also tap onto like the relationship between us and the Berlin fellows as well. They were very warm, very welcoming, invited us to a lot of very fun events. For example, like I went to one where they invited us to like this hip hop night, and it was just awesome because like they had people that were like rapping in French and whatnot. I don't speak French either, but it was just like, it was the vibe. It was the vibe. But I think definitely just trying to catch the vibe with them was awesome. But also onto the point about documenting as well, like it was kind of a tension because on one hand, when we were at Yodo and we were looking at the actual physical documents, like there's a lot of care that goes into keeping these documents around, carefully preserved. You have to be careful also in digitizing them. Hands have to be clean, for example. And so I'm also trying to think about that with the things I collected as well, like what to me may not seem as important to document or to keep, but for someone maybe couple of decades or a couple, centuries away who are trying to look at this moment, like what's going to be instrumental to them that I'm not even really sure is important to me at this moment.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I think it's also the question of what you said, the moments or how many different ways we're archiving, like the live archiving, but then who are we archiving? We archived Afrikete, but I remember looking at Peggy's book and there was a hair and I was like, okay, this is another form that's getting, like somebody's piece of hair that's gonna get archived and digitized, right? There are multiple levels of archiving happening, but wait, now I lost my thought.
The different forms of archiving and how you already said those.
But also who we are archiving when we're there and the time. I lost the last thing. Oh yes, activists, sorry, yes. And I think the question for me was thinking about who we're archiving for. There is the Black Berlin German community, and then being there as a researcher and thinking of my many frustrations of not finding things I want in Rome. And I was thinking, okay, so we're also archiving for this academic of sorts. So how do we bridge those two worlds together? What's the most important thing to keep? How should we keep it? What's also the visuality of it as well? Many different aspects that I think I had not really thought about before, that I just thought this was just another academic project, but it's more important also for the public and for the people who we're there for.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think some of it, I'm thinking here sort of in part in response to something that Professor Lewis said earlier about space making for those that come behind us, which isn't exactly what I think we're doing, because I think it's more of a or I hope at least it's more of sort of a lateral space making, which is to say that it's opening up space for those who are beside us, who maybe don't have the institutional power of a place like Yale or don't have the funding that comes with a place like Yale. And so, part of that is creating the manual. Part of that is, creating the website, is creating this web archive that we're also working on. And all of those processes, are sort of, I think are in some ways are sort of archiving in the moment in some ways. The manual especially is sort of, it's really trying to like put ourselves back in that archiving, not only headspace, but sort of the physical space, what things need to be done. How do you make sure that this is, relevant, pertinent, and sort of clear and coherent for someone who is going to be doing this in any number of spaces? And also when you're doing it, how do you ensure that you sort of don't take on any level of sort of authority or expertise? Because I think, I speak for myself, like I'm certainly not an expert on archiving. I was there and I participated in the project, but that's not to say that someone, who hopefully comes along and uses the manual afterwards won't spot sort of, glaring absences from what we've written or from what we've done and be able to sort of build upon that or fill in that hole or to take it in a new direction. So.
All right, thank you so much. I'd like to move on to what was difficult. Let's talk a bit about that. What kind of barriers did you come up against, or what would you say was difficult, and how did you work around it? Who wants to start?
Mine is really easy, and I don't think I've worked around this, maybe with more funding. I think one of my most difficult challenges was time. Although there were just so many things to go through, amazing transnational documents, just showing just the depth and diversity and the commitment to Black life that Black Berliners had in the 1980s, 70s. Like, it was just so exciting. And I wish we had more time to digitize it, because it was just that much. For me, it was just like I could spend the whole entire year just sifting through. So that was one of my challenges.
Yeah, I would definitely add to that. Like, I felt that my most usefulness, my most use on the trip was definitely like scanning the documents, putting them together, cataloging. And I think also in terms of cataloging, a difficulty was that a lot of the documents, some were in English, but a lot was in German. And so like also had to kind of like outsource the expertise. So I'm on like Google Translate, DeepL, like a word translates multiple ways. I'm looking at different dictionaries to see which one I think is the best in the context. That was a challenge. Hopefully the cataloging looks good. But I think definitely just a constraint, because there were a lot, just so much material. It was hard to really like adjudicate what do you think is the most important thing to collect. Also, like, how do you go between like very similar documents? So for example, one of the challenges I had was there was a collection of like meeting notes from an event that happened like 1990s, but then there was a version that was redacted as well. And so then there was a question of like, do I save the one that's non-redacted? Do I include the one that's all, like, do I scan both? Which one do I choose to scan? And so a lot of like real-time decisions like that, but then also going into what Sam was saying as well about the manual, trying to think also like document that. Okay, if you find a document that looks like it was saved, someone saved it for a reason, but then also do I repeat that? Like, how do I kind of like fit into the like path they left for me and like respect what's kind of already there. So that was also like another real challenge at that moment.
I mean, I think I agree with Faith in regards to sort of wanting more time. I think for me, it's less more time in the archives and sort of more time in the space with the students, with sort of the partners on the project. Because I think that, as far as like the archiving, I think, I felt as if we sort of went in with clear directives, in the sense that there were certain archives and there were certain collections that had been sort of explained to us as these were the archives that we really want to digitize in the time that we have. But then, as Jorge is saying, like, you have obviously, these archives aren't sort of siloed. There are other documents there. There are a multitude of other documents there. And again, you're sort of, you sort of give yourself to the process, right? You just become sort of the scanner because, you have the time, you have the tools, you have the means. But, to be able to have had sort of, I feel like we had thorough conversations about the things that we had been able to talk about prior to going on the trip. But, to have the time to have a conversation about the questions that you're raising with sort of the full team and to say, okay, we encountered this, what does this mean? I mean, obviously the opportunities for those conversations are not foreclosed. I mean, we're still in contact, obviously, with the INBEST team, with Professor El-Tayeb, and with, to a certain degree with the German grad students. But I think there's something about sort of the moment and the space and sort of the moment of archiving that lends itself to those questions and conversations.
So before I move on to the results, I'm going to look at all three of you and ask if there's anything you want to add around the barriers or what was difficult. Is there anything that's still relevant to that part of the discussion? Or can we move on to what we're trying to actually, what kind of result? It sounds really weird to say results, but obviously we're not doing this to not have something, some form of artifacts, or to achieve something. There's objectives. Is it okay to leave the barrier question? In case there are questions later, you can revisit that place. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what we are working towards. So you've already spoken about the website. That's a lot of work. For me, one of the things that I have to manage is that there's an overwhelming amount of data that we are, maybe that's why I'm so bad at Instagram, because I have all these photos and then I don't know if I can select 20 photos and just post them, or if no one looks at that, I have no idea. I don't know if anyone feels this way. I'm overwhelmed sometimes by a lot of data. And then I don't know, what do I start with? And we want to do this website, we want to make, like we say in German, wir wollen niemand erschlagen. We don't want to like hit someone over the head with the website and you open it and close it because you're so overwhelmed. So there's also that element. So yeah, I'm beginning to answer my own question. Tell us something about the results. How at the point at which you are now in the process, after being in Berlin, coming back to New Haven, you've been here for a couple of months, the new semester has begun. How are you looking at what we are trying to achieve as results from this moment?
So I think I would think about that in sort of two tenses, right? So there's sort of the present, I think, pragmatically speaking, practically speaking, materially speaking, we're trying to finish the manual. We're trying to have, a baseline for this web archive. We're trying to make sure that everything is digitized and properly cataloged, and things of that nature, and trying to do that sort of in a timely manner with sort of the time frame of this semester, given funding, given things of that nature. I think on the larger scale, and here, I'm speaking only for myself, I think in some ways, like the goal would be that any sort of, in 5 years, like this same panel is happening, but it's not us and it's not here. Talking about, there have been many references sort of to brain drain and the spaces in which these conversations take place. Obviously, I make no, I don't think that we're obviously not the only people doing this. The people in this room are not the only people doing this. It's not to say that it will be because of what we did that it won't happen here. But I think, yeah, to me, the goal would be that, and the next time, in the context, at least of INBEST, that this conversation happens, that it's, you have 3 German grad students or 3 Italian grad students or 3 French grad students, or not even grad students, it doesn't even, to move beyond the university as well. That it's not here, it's not us.
Yeah, I definitely echo a lot of your sentiments, and I agree. And I think also for me, part of it is seizing the means of intellectual production, seizing the means of archiving production as well, to not sort of like allow documents to enter, as been mentioned earlier, a sort of like political economy around the university, that researchers now have to come to the global north, they have to come to Yale to like see these documents, but instead there's a certain kind of like autonomy and sovereignty that the documents and the information can have. I think that's really important. And then also, again, just the posterity of it. I think there's a quote by Gramsci that says that each person is intellectual, each person's a historian, we're all archivists, and just to really sort of like step into those roles and take ownership of it.
And I think I'm excited for this space and for everyone who's here today, because we're going to be forming great relationships and collaborations so we can continue this project. With the web archive, we're looking to collect a whole lot of databases from Europe. We have not defined a lot of these categories that we're using. So bear with us as we move on to the project. So that is the immediate goal for this semester, to come up with something. We're sourcing information and material, and we have some questions in the back for you about how you define Black Europe, and if you have encountered any Black archives that you can list them for us, because we are trying to really compile this space for everyone, whether you're an academic, an activist, a Black European who's just interested in learning more, that there's going to be a space where you can just find all that information.
Thank you so much, Faith, because you're already bringing the conversation more to what the public would like to say. I'd just like to say it was a pleasure spending time with all of you in Berlin. That was one thing. There was potluck Tuesdays, and there was a lot of stuff that just happened on both sides, on all sides. There was some stuff that went the wrong way, but that we kind of saved. Hail Mary passes. Okay, it was awesome spending time with you. So let's hear from you, from the public, and also from the other Yale fellows who would like to add something. Yes, there's a microphone right here to Michael here in the second row. Ndumi, thank you.
Thank you. This touches a little bit on one of the previous conversations about intergenerational, and I'm thinking about the future. So as we know, there's all sorts of archives, and archives are used by people in power, powerful institutions, but they're also then used against those. You know, you can read the Inquisition archive differently than it was intended, right? So as an archivist, you're creating something, and very clearly in terms of the objects, they're staying in the community. That's, you know, how it should be, post-custodial archiving. But in terms of the access, imagining the future access, not control, but, you know, being able to read it and use it. Obviously, you want future community members present, but it could be future historians, people who've thought of things you never thought of. So how do you think about that a lot? It's what archivists have always done, but of course, they've always been limited by their imagination of who those users are. So I'm curious how you conceive of the future users of the archive and how that might influence, even when you were looking at this document that was redacted versus not redacted. There might be a very good reason for that. There might be identifying names, things like that, or just maybe it's embarrassing. You know, not everything is great. So do you include that or not? So how do you reflect on that notion of thinking about users, but also because in some ways you're archiving something you're sympathetic to, right? So does that influence also the kinds of things you may include or not include?
Great question. I'm really going to come to Peggy in the first row.
I mean, I think, again, this is sort of I think Professor El-Tayeb said something to this effect earlier, sort of talking about how access might be determined to this digital archive, how it's not necessarily just the World Wide Web, that it may be IP determined. I mean, I think some of this is why this has to be, you know, it has to be sort of a decentralized, it can't be us making that decision. I mean, we've collected the documents, and we've collected the documents in collaboration with members of the community who created that document, who have said these documents need to be created or need to be collected. We feel that these need to be preserved. But I think, you know, as far as how we feel about the documents, you know, whether we're sympathetic to the documents or not, I think at the end of the day, you know, is not unimportant. But as far as I understand the purposes of the archive, it's less about